screen. Okay, I assume it's looking good for everyone. We debated about offering this one on the Zoom. When we do it in person, we offer this as it's an insect ID contest. And so we actually go through each of the pictures. So I'll have numbers in my pictures. And we require the audience to try to identify what's in the picture and do an answer sheet. We're not going to do that today, but we still thought it would be beneficial to go through these insects. We sometimes find that that's kind of just a very useful thing for a lot of people as we're moving into the growing season. So the insects that we choose to use, usually it's like, what have we been getting a lot of questions on over the past few years? What was a common issue last season? And that's how we decide. So you can ignore the numbers because they were for the actual contest. But what I did here is in the very first, the month that I give, that's when that symptom was typically found or when this picture was taken. And we include that in there for the ID contest because when you're identifying insects, you know what time of the year it is that the person, your client is contacting you, asking the question and so on. We know what the time of the year is. At the bottom, you'll see I have the words June into early July. At the bottom, I put the time that we would typically be actually using a control method for this insect pest. And you probably know clientele, when they see a problem, they want something done now. They're concerned about their plant. If I don't do anything, I may lose it. I won't be able to control it later. But in many cases, especially when we're using pesticides, if that's the control option that we use or the client chooses to use, the timing of that application is critical as to whether it's effective or not. And so that's why I did that in these slides. So this, you probably know, is bagworm and has been common for some time. So this picture was taken later in the summer in pretty severe damage. You know, those bags, you can see the bags hanging down here. Okay, so this is probably in late August, given the size of the bags. And they're camouflaged quite well up higher. But if you look closer, I'm sure you'd find a lot of the bags as well. This is about the size they are this time of the year. And the eggs are overwintering in the female bags. Only the females will have eggs inside of them. So every single bag we see on a tree, it isn't necessarily filled with numerous eggs. It's only the female ones, but we can't tell that by looking at them. So this time of the year, we will tell clientele to go ahead and try to pick those off, drop them in a bucket of soapy water or whatnot. Don't pick them off and just drop them in the bottom underneath the tree on the ground, because the eggs can still hatch out and move up onto the tree. So August is when we may see the most damage, is starting in maybe late July, but August, September is probably when I get the most questions. Spruce, they can be on any evergreen. We see them a lot on spruce. Here it's a juniper, I believe. Arborvitae, they're very common on. They will get on our broadleaf trees too, but they don't cause much damage to broadleaf trees because there's so many leaves and those leaves are temporary. By the time the damage is caused, it's getting towards the end of the season and the tree is going to lose those leaves anyway as a deciduous tree. And so controlling them, I don't have much concern on deciduous trees unless it was a really young one and it was, you know, overwhelmed and completely defoliated. But if this is one we do recommend control on, there's a number of insects I'll talk about here where I'll say, well, you know, it's aesthetic. Really isn't going to harm the plant. We really don't need to control it. But bagworms on evergreens populations can build up quite high, and they can cause extensive damage and cause a large portion and not the entire tree to die. So, but the timing, the eggs begin to hatch about late May, with most of the hatching taking place in June. And so that's June, probably that mid to late June is the ideal time to be spraying. You've given time for most of the eggs to hatch, but they're still tiny enough. When they first hatch, they're very tiny. And in June, they're probably going to be anywhere from 1/8 of an inch, those little bags, to 1/4 of an inch. It isn't until we get into July usually that we start seeing them about 1/2 of an inch and larger. So when they're small, before they do the damage is the ideal time to control. And I I'm not necessarily going to get into insecticides today, but I will a little bit. So if a client, you or a clientele wanted to go, at least a lower risk option, the Bacillus thuringiensis, the dipel products, for example, Thuricide, spinosad, would be used, but those really are only highly effective on the very young ones. So you need to use those early in the season. If you get into, that mid to late July, early August, and they're still feeding, they're still active in feeding, they will. That's when we need to go to some of those more synthetic chemicals like the pyrethroids. And again, please type in any questions you have in the chat. I can answer them later. Emily is on, and Emily can help answer them as we go. Okay, so this is, again, why did we include this? Because it's something one of us was questioned about last year. And I've started to see an increase in this. So this is Spirea leaf roller. Okay, the homeowner might look at it and say, well, my leaves are turning brown, so I must have a disease. So, but if you look closer, or they look closer, you can see some chewing damage on the foliage. And if you unfurl those leaves are kind of rolled up in their web together. If you kind of unfurl them with your hands, you'll see webbing inside there. You may or may not see the larva insect doing the damage because they may already be gone. So they're not there the whole entire season. So it's aesthetic. It's usually closer to the tips of the branches. So this is a particular one that we say you don't need to control it if you don't want to. I use the analogy that's kind of like people having a cold, or I don't say this to young people, but I'll say it to adults. It's like teenagers having pimples sometimes. They don't like it, but in the long run, they'll go away. So control is not needed. Now, if a homeowner wants to snip those out and discard them, that could help to reduce that population and just improve the appearance of the shrub. So again, not a landscape one, but we've had more questions on this the last few years, but this is bumble flower beetle. And then the black ones, there's also little black ones, those are sap beetles. Okay, and they're really not a plant pest. They're attracted to overripe fruit. So rarely do they cause damage to leaves, well, they won't cause damage to leaves or to foliage. We only see them in that overripe fruit. So they're called a bumble flower beetle because they kind of buzz. They sound like a bumblebee if you're nearby them. And I've had people say that I have a beetle in my garden that's buzzing. So, but no, we don't recommend sprays for this one either, but good sanitation. We'll tell people just stay on top of harvesting. Do prompt harvesting. If you do get some fruit that becomes overripe or drops to the ground, sanitation, clean it up, get it out of there. And that will reduce those numbers. So this was in June, and this is on hackberry. And again, when the clients or a homeowner will see those leaves with all those holes in there, they might sometimes say, well, an insect must be chewing on my leaves. In this particular case, it is not an insect, although sometimes that's what homeowners think, so they might revert to, well, I need to apply an insecticide. And, we want to use, pesticides are a good tool we have for pest management, but we want to use them when they're needed. We don't want to overuse them for the environmental effects for our pollinators, just, that possibility of pest building up resistance. And so we no longer have that as a tool when it is needed. So this is one, again, it's common for me, and we share this because people will call me and they'll say my hackberry leaves are getting chewed up. But usually it's not an insect. It can be wind tatter. So as those leaves are, especially if it's in June, May, June. So as those leaves are emerging, they're very tender. And sometimes we'll get hot, windy days. The last few years, we've had some really hot, really windy days in May and June. And that can just tatter, that can tear those leaves and tatter. And as they continue to expand, you'll see that damage. Freeze damage, if they start to emerge, those buds start to swell and we get a hard freeze. Hackberry leaves are pretty hardy, but you get that hard freeze and that can damage that tissue and as they expand. Herbicide damage, herbicide drift, which we're seeing an increase in, that can damage that tissue as well. And as it expands, it can kind of look tattered. So we call this hackberry leaf tatter. Looks like an insect, but it isn't. This is bluegrass billbug. I honestly have not seen a lot of this the last few years. If anybody on this call has been seeing bluegrass billbug, I'd really like you to put it in the chat. It's been a number of years since I've actually seen bluegrass billbug. And I think some of it is because of the preventives that we're applying for our white grubs. They they can work as well. So, but bluegrass billbug, the adult is, well, that's the little critter. Looks like a rice kernel with a red head and puffed up rice, and that's about the size of it. It's not very big, as compared to a white grub, which is much larger and has the legs and is usually curled up into a C shape. So, and that's the adult. It is a weevil. And adult weevils emerge in May. They overwinter as adults in this case, and they emerge in May. They lay their eggs basically inside the stems of the bluegrass. And so that larva, once it hatches, then it starts to bore. You can see why it looks like frass. So it'll work its way down those stems and then into the soil. And once it's in the soil, then the larvae will feed on the roots. And it takes a high, there's a high threshold. It takes, oh gosh, it's been so long since I've identified it. I can't remember the threshold, but I think it's something like 16 or maybe even 32 per square foot. It takes quite a few. 32 seems high. Anyway, if you do see the damage and it is harmful enough, so 1 year, usually when you'd see this damage in July, we don't recommend control at that time at all, because the damage is already done. And about mid-July, these larvae move deep into the soil. They stop deeper into the soil. They stop feeding, and an insecticide would not be beneficial. It would essentially be a waste of money for the homeowner's client. If the damage is unacceptable, and so that lawn has that history that one season, then the next season you would want to aim your control at the weevils in May. That's the recommendation. Okay, a common pest, at least, especially if you're in the eastern half of the state. So Japanese beetles. So again, remember when we put this together, it was for an ID contest. And so we know this is common. You're getting a lot of questions on it. Honestly, here in Columbus, I've had very, very little damage, very few questions. Just maybe 2 years ago was when I first got my very first question on it. So I keep waiting for it to kind of explode and be worse, but so far it's very slow. But anyway, this is on river birch. This was in Schuyler. This was a picture taken over in the Schuyler area. And you can see they usually do their feeding in June and July, early August, and they skeletonize the damage over here. They skeletonize those leaves, eat the green tissue off, and then leave the veins. We call it skeletonizing. Japanese beetles, we can identify by those tufts. There's 5 tufts on each side of white hairs. Helps to distinguish from other similar feeding beetles. They can feed on about 300 different types of plants, so they're not host specific like many of our insect pests that will only feed on one type of plant or genus of plant. They can do a lot of damage to a lot of things. So lindens, especially hard hit in the Omaha-Lincoln area where they've had them longer. Lindens, like I said, in Platte County and Colfax County, it's been river birch, not as bad as linden. Grapes, particularly bad of grapes. They can be an issue. They can be a problem for soybeans, for soybean farmers. So, but we can find them on a lot of things, but they definitely have certain food preferences. In most cases, especially for the woody plants, the trees, they don't kill those trees. They can make them look really, really rough, and it is a stress. It is a stress losing that foliage, and you have less photosynthesis, and that's how it stresses the plant. So some people choose to control them, other people do not choose to control them. You would provide control during feeding, preferably before much damage occurs once you start seeing them. If you wait until mid-August, they're just about finished feeding for the year anyway. Some clients will think, well, if I kill these, I won't have any next year. It doesn't work that way. So you want to time control early in the feeding stage if it's a young plant, if it's feasible to apply an insecticide for. So there are insecticides that can be used. There are the organic ones. Some people, if it's a small enough plant, they'll just tell people to take a stick and kind of tap that tree and knock as many of those beetles as you can into a soapy bucket of water. Sometimes our clientele do not want a fine insecticide, so that's an option to give them. And if you're wondering where they are in Nebraska, this is the most recent map I could find. So you can see they are in, it says they've been in Platte County prior to 2019. But I only started getting calls about 2 years ago, and I have very few calls, maybe 5 a year. So that's pretty limited. But they are spreading across the state. This is pine needle scale on our pine trees. So this picture was taken in June, and they overwinter as eggs. So the insect is overwintering as an egg underneath some of the scales. Now, a lot of these scales that you see are previous year scales, and they don't have any eggs under there. So sometimes when you look at this, you can think, wow, there's a lot of insects there. But the old scale remains, and it may just be an old scale with no insect underneath it. So they overwinter as eggs underneath that scale. They hatch out in May, typically in about the time that the pines are kindling, that new growth. They'll crawl to that new growth and bed themselves, and then start to feed they feed on the sap. If control is needed, often control for this is not needed, but if the population's getting quite high, it can cause some stress. And Sarah was talking about stacking of stress. So between the drought, between extremes in weather, we're looking at some of these pests that we used to say, oh, the tree's fine and, don't worry about it. But if it's high numbers and it seems to be spreading year after year, there might be a minor stress, but that we don't want to stack on top of another one. You might want to consider control. But the time would be typically in May, when they're in the crawler stage. So once they embed themselves, and things like horticultural oils, insecticidal soaps, even some of if you have a systemic that the tree will take up, that will work later in the season as well. But the most effective time to control them is in that crawler stage. Rose slugs, at least, especially in Platte County, I've been seeing an increase in this in the last few years, and they're very good at camouflage. You can see there's a slug, there's a slug, there's a slug. There's quite a few on here, but they blend in quite well with the foliage. So they are the larvae of a sawfly. And, again, it's another one of those things where homeowners that grow roses love their roses, and they don't want to see their leaves doing this. And it's early in the season. It's typically late May through June that we're seeing a lot of this damage. And they also feed on the green tissue and skeletonize the leaves. They don't typically kill the plant, but they can stress it. If it's a rose that's on the borderline of hardiness, that could increase winter injury, may reduce blooming. So again, it's one where we say, if you don't want to control it, you don't need to. If you do, only control it when you can find the slugs and they're present, because they're not there for very long. So typically, once we get past the middle of June, late June, the damage is still there, but you can't find the insect itself. And so if an insect is not there, no need to control. And what happens with a lot of the roses is they'll put on new foliage, and that'll help the plant. And that's why it rarely kills the plant. May, this is in May, and this is an ash lilac borer. It's a clear-winged moth. Okay, it attacks ash and lilac trees. So this picture is of a lilac. So usually fairly large round holes, 3/16 of an inch round holes. Sometimes when the adult emerges, this is that pupal case. So often we rarely see the moth itself because it's a night flyer. So we rarely encounter the moth. The larvae are inside the tree, but you will sometimes notice this pupal case that is left behind after the moth emerges in May. Usually they may emerge in May and they're laying eggs. And with many of our borers, that's when we recommend spraying, especially for lilac, where we will say just spray the base of that plant rather than the entire plant, because that tends to be where they lay eggs on lilac. You don't always see the frass, especially if the irrigation water is hitting it or we get rainfall in May, but sometimes you do get lucky and you can find that frass. Looks like sawdust. And I will mention on this one, this is one of the borers that tends to attack stress plants. Okay, rather than healthy plants tend not to be stressed. So use mulch around them correctly. So this is honeysuckle aphid. You know, when I started over 40 years ago, I used to get a lot of questions on honeysuckle aphid. And then for a long time, I didn't get any questions, but it seems like I'm starting to get a few more questions on it again. And they cut, as an aphid, they're a sap feeder, and they feed on the tips of the young tender growth of honeysuckle, and that stimulates weird growth, stunting, and we get what we call kind of a witch's broom effect. Okay, and then if you go in there and you pull that plant apart, you should be able to find some of the aphids. We consider this one aesthetic as well. So sanitation in the fall, so having homeowners clip these out, they overwinter as eggs in this witch's broom. So if the homeowner clips that out in fall and kind of discards it, then that'll help reduce the numbers for the next year. And that's about all we recommend. They are soft-bodied insects, but they are kind of somewhat protected inside this witch's broom. So they're a little harder to control with some of the contact insecticides or things like insecticidal soaps, because they are protected inside there. And these aphids are around all season. There's numerous generations. They have all female. In the summer, they're all females and they reproduce asexually. So the populations can build up quite high. It's only in the fall that they produce what we call sexual, and so male and female. So then they mate and then they lay the eggs that overwinter. But I share that because some people will go out and they'll clip that foliage, that witch's broom off there, and they can, but that stimulates new growth. And the aphids are often still there. There's still some there, and they love that new growth. And so you'll still get it repeated over and over. So that's why we say the sanitation in the fall is going to do the most towards management. Okay, I have 20 pictures here if you're wondering. So we're halfway through. Okay, so this is June. The time period is June, and a client has asked you to look at their spruce, or they brought in a sample. And, you know, the typical stippling that we see with mites. So mites have those needle-like mouth parts that they insert, and they insert it numerous times to feed on the sap. And that's why we get that's what we call a stippled effect, kind of a bronzing eventually. Sometimes you can see a little bit of webbing in there. So we'll see that damage often in June. But if you notice, I'm saying we don't do any application or spraying until April or September. Now, this is for spruce mites. Okay, spruce mites are a cool season mite. So they're only active usually in April, in the spring, and in the fall is when they're active. And then they over summer in an egg stage. So they overwinter in the egg, they hatch, they feed, then they lay eggs again, or they go dormant, and they're just not active. They're not feeding during the summer. So you're not going to get as much control. You see that damage when that damage becomes noticeable sometimes in June, maybe even later. And you look underneath the microscope, or you look with a small hand lens, you can't find any active mites on there. Or you do the little white paper test, and you won't find any active mites. An insecticide or a miticide is not going to do any good at that time. So that's why if a plant we know, you see that's damaged, just get the homeowner to just let them hose it down with water if they might feel better. And then in September, you may want to go ahead and consider a miticide, or you could use the horticultural oils, a summer rate, for example, or April. So if you look closely, here's in the summer, those are the eggs. Okay? They're reddish, they're kind of reddish orange, and that's a lot of times what we'll see on the plant during the summer months or the winter months. And the mite, spruce mite, is kind of reddish. Okay. So if you do the paper test, a lot of times when I do the paper test, somebody brings me a sample in the office and I tap it over paper. I don't wait to see if the specks start crawling around. I just take my hand and I smear it across the paper. And if the dust, what looks like dust specks smear red with some other types of mites, it might be yellow, it might be green, but dust is not going to smear red. So then I know those mites are present. But that's what a spruce mite looks like. Now we do a red spider mite, two-spotted spider mite. They can be on evergreens during the summer months. So again, you want to do that white paper test to see if there's active mites on there. But the most common mite we tend to see on spruce is a spruce mite, cool season mite, dormant in the summer, so we wouldn't be making applications of anything for control. This is one that I've never seen in Platte County. Sarah tells me it's very common in Lincoln area. I don't know, Emily, I don't know if it's common out west, but I think I've seen it once in my area.
I haven't had it.
Yeah, I know it's more of a problem, I believe, in far eastern Nebraska or southeastern. Like Sarah says, it's a pretty common problem in her area. But this is Zimmerman pine moth. It's Austrian and ponderosa pine, Scotch pine too, but we're losing most of our Scotch pine is what it's most common on. It's a borer. The adult is a moth, lays their eggs, and they hatch out, and then they feed right in, usually in the forks of those branches, and it feeds right underneath. It causes, at some times of the year, this mass can be pink. It's when it's fresh, it looks like pink bubble gum. So very easy to identify. And what they do is they weaken in those branches, and you start in wind and snow and ice, you just get a lot more breakage. And sometimes the branches, if it's enough damage, the branch can get dieback of a branch, even the trunk. So if it's a problem, an issue that we might see this in May, even in June, homeowners might notice it. But the time to spray is that second week of April and the second week of August. Those are two time periods, two generations, two time periods when that larvae is going to be there. And your sprays only work unless use the case of a systemic, sort of like a soil drench, where it's a systemic, if that larvae is still very close to the surface or has not bored in yet. So that timing is kind of iffy. This is maple bladder gall. It's very striking because it's bright red. It's a little mite, okay? And when they're feeding, when they're doing that sap sucking, they stimulate the leaves to grow this little gall on them. They're bright, vivid red. And there can be hundreds on one leaf. But usually it affects such a small number of leaves that we really don't worry about it. It's aesthetic, it's not harmful. The trees have numerous leaves. It's only there. We only see this in May, maybe early June, and then the mites stop feeding. They're not there year round or all summer, all season. And so the homeowners see it, they get a little bit concerned. Those galls will turn black eventually, so it becomes more noticeable. Numerous galls, the tree might drop some of those leaves, which can be concerning. But what I tell homeowners sometimes is I'll say, well, pay no attention to the leaves on the ground. Stand back and look at that tree. If the tree still looks very fully leafed, it has enough leaves for photosynthesis, it's doing its job. And so this is one that I make the analogy to a teenager possibly having pimples. I know they don't like it. I know it's mentally stressful for them, but in the long run, it doesn't physically hurt them. This is Oncotoniaster. This is woolly aphid. Really easy to identify because it looks kind of woolly. But if you go in there with your hands, it would be sticky, slimy, but this aphid produces this little white fluffy stuff on the outside of it. Aphid feeder doesn't cause a lot of damage to Cotoneaster. A blast of water would wash them away and make it look a little bit better. Otherwise, it's not one that we consider a harmful pest in the long run, only more of a nuisance and a little bit unsightly. Okay, so Kermes scale on oak. We're starting to see an increase in this. We're starting to see a little more damage, twig dieback, branch dieback. So it is a little bit concerning. You might notice the dieback in some twig dieback or branch dieback. Usually it's small branches in July, and you look closer, kind of looks like a tortoise shell almost sometimes. Okay, and this is a pretty high population here. Again, they're a sap sucker. It's a scale insect. So the scale is underneath there feeding on the sap. And it can, high enough population, you can get some dieback. So this is one where we don't want to stress. We don't want to have that extra stress or that added layer of stress on plants. So it is one that we're starting to lean towards telling people to go ahead and control if they have high populations and are starting to see some dieback. It's kind of an odd one. I think it's a different species of Kermes scale. So on pin oaks, We ideally you spray during that crawler stage. That would be in September. Okay. For bur oak, it would be April and June. Now, you can use a systemic, such as an imidacloprid or a soil drench. So that timing would be different for your soil. You want it in the plant when those crawlers are present. Okay, this is another one that's a little bit odd one for a landscape audience, but again, people will bring in questions. They'll ask you questions, or if it's your garden center, which is a ProHort audience. But these are blister beetles. So want to help people answer those client questions. So, and we've been seeing them increase in them. I'm getting more and more calls on them all the time. You don't want to handle them. They have cantharidin in it. So if you swat it, grab it, squeeze it, you're going to get a nasty blister. And that's why they're called blister beetles. They're actually beneficial. The larvae of blister beetles, they lay eggs in the soil and they feed on grasshopper eggs. So they are considered one of our beneficials. However, in this case, they're on potatoes. This picture was mailed to me by a client last year. Sometimes they will do quite a bit of damage to potatoes, but it's pretty rare. It's usually late enough in the season that they still get a production. So we rarely recommend control for these. But we do warn people, it's probably not one you want to hand pick, drop into a bucket of soapy water unless you have gloves on. Okay, late July, actually it's even early July. I know it's our county fair is the first week of July. And right after county fair, I start getting these questions. And so this is the cicada killer wasp that causes that. Okay, so usually they see the wasp. It's our gentle giant. They can be up to 2 inches long, so they are quite scary. But they're a solitary wasp, so there's only one per nest. So what causes this pile of dirt frequently along sidewalks or driveways is where we'll see it. But that adult, the cicada killer wasp, is creating a nest. It's called a cicada killer because they sting and paralyze the cicada once they get that nest built, and they drag it into the nest. They lay an egg on it, and then after the egg hatches, it feeds on the cicada in the nest, and then pupates and then emerges the next year. We can ignore them. That's what we encourage people, is just to ignore them, because they're kind of a gentle giant. They'll leave you alone if you don't try to swat them or step on them. Sometimes you'll have a home where somebody's fairly highly allergic and they want to do something about it. So in that case, we'll often say to dust that nest with 7 dust or something, carbaryl or something such as that. Probably 7 dust. I think carbaryl is being taken off the market, but there's still products called 7 dust that you can dust it with, and as long as they're active. Now, sometimes I say they're solitary. It's not unusual. They have a number of these nests nearby because they kind of tend to be communal, but it's not a hive. The homeowner doesn't have to worry that there's a hive in there and there's going to be a whole bunch of them coming out and attacking them because there's only one per nest. These are the calls we get in September. Something tore my lawn up. So it's usually raccoons or skunks that are digging for those full-grown grubs. Grubs are full-grown by the end of the season. Again, with preventive grub products, this question has greatly decreased, but I have gotten a few the last few years. So there are those raccoons and skunks. They're getting ready for winter, and they want to get fattened up for winter, so they're going after those fat grubs. And if it's raccoons, a lot of times, if it makes a difference with raccoons, they tend to roll the sod back and kind of with their hands and pick out the grubs. If it's all kind of scratched up and a lot of damage, and more likely it's skunks that are just kind of scratching with their claws, if that makes a difference. But it's too late, way too late in the season. We do not recommend applying insecticides for grubs this late in the season. They're essentially at the finished feeding. They're large, very difficult to kill. They're going to move deeper into the soil. So we just tell people at this time to reset sod and water it to help it recover, which it can and it will. Needed, if it's still thin the next year, they could do a little overseeding. So if they're out there, again, the only time we usually recommend grub control is if there's a history of damage on a lawn, and or 5 to 8 grubs can be found per square foot. So if you're using the preventive, you have to go by the history because you typically apply those before eggs hatch. Okay, this is in July, and we have euonymus scale. This is one of those interesting enough, probably my first 30 years in extension. I never got a call on this. My peers in Omaha and Lincoln always complained about, not really complained, but just commented that, wow, we're getting a lot of euonymus scale questions. I only started getting these questions about 10 years ago, and I do believe that is a factor of climate change. We're starting to see some of these insects move a little further north, a little further west, just very slowly. Anyway, it's very easy to identify. It's a scale, so sap-sucking insect. You can see how dense they can get on the branches and the stems as well as the leaves. Euonymus, especially the binding ones, are pretty vigorous. So you prune it. If all the homeowner needs to do is prune it out if they want to. If they do want to control it, then May into June during the egg hatch when they're in that crawler stage. And monitor it because this is one where we can have multiple generations through the summer. You don't just have that one egg hatch in May or early June. Okay, last one, an insect that's not found in Nebraska, but when we do this, when we do our ID contest, sometimes things to be watching for, we like to include on there. So this is what spotted lanternfly, you've probably been hearing about it, not found in Nebraska yet. It's one of those invasive species. And this is the egg mass. This is kind of a fresher egg mass that goes on the plant in the fall for overwintering. And it's people that are out in the field, you might, front lines, you might notice this. They love tree of heaven. Hope tree of heaven is an invasive as well. So hopefully we're slowly getting rid of those. But they can be found on many types of trees and plants. In the spring, this is after the eggs have hatched. And then they're a leaf hopper, a plant hopper. So that's what they look like. The youngest ones, they have an incomplete life cycle. So the younger ones just kind of look like a little miniature plant hopper. And then as they go through different molting, then eventually this is what the adult looks like. And you've probably seen that, you might have seen that it looks like when the wings are fully open, it almost looks like a very pretty orange and black and white moth, but it's actually a leaf hopper, plant hopper. So there's sap feeders. So we just ask to be aware of these, to keep your eyes open for them. And if you do find them or see anything that you think is this, you can report it to your local extension office or the Nebraska Department of Ag. And that's the end of that, as well as the end of our Zoom for today. Any questions for me or Emily? Thank you, Mary. Have a safe trip back from Colorado tomorrow. I assume you are still out there. Okay, well, we appreciate your joining us. We know we had a small group today, but we recorded this and we want to be able to have these presentations so we can possibly use them with other people or in another way or give access to the people that registered but weren't able to join today.